Growing up, my dad always said I'd never amount to anything with my fancy college nonsense. He spent 37 years working the assembly line at Peterson Manufacturing, proud of his calloused hands and steady paycheck. When I graduated with my finance degree and landed a job as a risk assessment analyst at some company he'd never heard of, he laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. Risk assessment? What kind of made-up job is that, Sarah? You sit at a desk all day playing with numbers, while real people do real work. Little did he know, those numbers I was playing with would soon determine whether his retirement dreams lived or died. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this story begins on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, when I was 26 years old. I was rushing through the revolving doors of Meridian Financial Group's downtown Chicago office, clutching my coffee and trying not to think about the phone call I'd had with my dad the night before. He'd called to brag about his upcoming retirement party, scheduled for the end of the year, and somehow managed to slip in another dig about my pretend career. You know, Sarah, your old man's gonna retire with more money than you'll probably make in 5 years with that computer job of yours, he'd said, chuckling in that way that made my stomach clench. Real work pays real money, sweetheart. Maybe it's not too late for you to learn a trade. I'd bitten my tongue as usual. There was no point explaining to him what I actually did at Meridian. How could I make him understand that my job involved analyzing investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars? That pension funds, insurance companies, and major corporations relied on my reports to make decisions that affected thousands of people's financial futures? To him, if you weren't physically building something or fixing something, you weren't really working. The elevator dinged as I reached the 42nd floor, where our risk assessment division occupied the entire northwest corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, though I rarely had time to appreciate it. My cubicle was modest compared to the corner offices where the senior partners worked, but it was mine, and I was proud of what I'd accomplished in just 3 years since joining the company. My colleague Jennifer was already at her desk, scrolling through her morning emails with a concerned expression. "Morning, Sarah. Have you seen the Henderson Industries file yet?" I shook my head, settling into my chair and powering up my dual monitors. "What's going on with Henderson?" "Marcus wants us to do a deep dive on their pension fund management. Apparently, there have been some irregularities in their investment choices over the past 18 months. Nothing criminal, but some seriously questionable decision-making that's put their retirees at risk." Henderson Industries. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it immediately. Chicago had dozens of mid-sized manufacturing companies, and they all started to blur together after a while. I pulled up our client database and began scrolling through the preliminary information that had been forwarded from our intake department. Founded in 1987, Henderson Industries specialized in automotive parts manufacturing. They employed roughly 800 people across 2 facilities in the Chicago metropolitan area, with their main plant located in Schaumburg. Their pension fund currently managed approximately $43 million in assets, covering benefits for both current employees and retirees. The red flags were immediately apparent in the investment allocation charts. Over the past year and a half, whoever was managing their portfolio had made a series of increasingly aggressive moves. They'd shifted money out of stable government bonds and blue-chip stocks into high-risk ventures, cryptocurrency funds, startup tech companies, and something called alternative energy futures that made my eyebrows rise. "This is bad," I muttered, clicking through page after page of transactions. "Jennifer, look at this." They moved $12 million out of their stable growth fund into Bitcoin derivatives last August. Bitcoin derivatives for a pension fund. Jennifer wheeled her chair over to peer at my screen. "Ouch, that's like using your retirement money to bet on roulette. What were they thinking?" I continued digging through the files, my coffee growing cold as I became absorbed in the data. The pattern was clear. Someone at Henderson Industries had been making increasingly desperate investment choices, chasing higher returns without considering the devastating risks to retirees who depended on this money for their basic living expenses. The most troubling discovery came when I cross-referenced their investment timeline with market performance data. Every single high-risk move had been made at exactly the wrong time. They'd bought into cryptocurrency right before the major crash in September. They'd invested heavily in a green energy startup just weeks before news broke about the company's accounting irregularities. It was like watching someone systematically destroy $43 million in slow motion. "I need to call Marcus," I said, reaching for my phone. "This isn't just poor judgment. This is a potential crisis waiting to happen." Quote. Marcus Rodriguez, our department head, answered on the second ring. "Sarah, good timing. I was just about to come find you. How's the Henderson analysis coming along?" "Not good, Marcus. Not good at all. Their portfolio management over the past 18 months has been catastrophic. If current market trends continue, their pension fund could be facing a shortfall of anywhere from $15 to $20 million by the end of this fiscal year." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "20 million? Sarah, are you certain about those numbers?" I double-checked my calculations, running the projections through our risk modeling software one more time. The results were consistent and deeply troubling. "I'm certain." "Marcus, there are 800 current employees at Henderson, plus approximately 400 retirees already drawing benefits. If this fund goes insolvent, we're talking about 1,200 families who could lose their retirement security. I'm coming down to your desk right now. Don't discuss this with anyone else until I get there." The gravity in Marcus's voice sent a chill down my spine. In 3 years of working at Meridian, I'd analyzed dozens of troubled investment portfolios, but I'd never heard him sound quite this serious. While I waited for him to arrive, I began compiling a preliminary report, organizing the data into clear, devastating charts that showed exactly how Henderson's pension fund had been systematically undermined. Marcus appeared at my cubicle 10 minutes later, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. He was carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd been dealing with crisis management all morning. "Show me everything," he said, pulling up a chair beside my desk. I walked him through my findings methodically. The initial investment portfolio from 18 months ago had been conservative but solid, exactly what you'd expect from a responsible pension fund. 70% government bonds and high-grade corporate bonds, 25% blue-chip stocks, 5% in slightly more aggressive growth investments. It was boring, predictable, and safe. Then something had changed. The first risky investment had been relatively small. $2 million moved into a emerging markets fund that promised higher returns. When that investment had performed well initially, whoever was making the decisions had apparently decided to get more aggressive. "Look at this transaction from last November," I said, pointing to a particularly egregious entry. They pulled $8 million out of Treasury bonds, Marcus, and put it into something called Blockchain Innovation Partners. I researched this company. It was founded 6 months before Henderson invested in it, and it went bankrupt 3 weeks ago. Marcus rubbed his temples. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Henderson Industries isn't just any client. They're connected to some very powerful people in this city. The mayor's brother-in-law sits on their board of directors. 2 city council members have significant investments in the company. If their pension fund collapses, it's not just going to hurt retirees, it's going to become a major political scandal." The weight of what he was telling me began to sink in. This wasn't just about poor investment choices anymore. This was about corruption, political connections, and the kind of story that ended up on the front page of the Chicago Tribune with some very angry people looking for someone to blame. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "I need you to dig deeper. I need you to find out exactly who's been making these investment decisions, when they started, and whether there's any evidence of deliberate misconduct. And, Sarah," he lowered his voice, "this stays between us for now. Don't even discuss it with Jennifer. If word gets out before we have all the facts, people are going to start covering their tracks." After Marcus left, I sat alone at my desk, staring at the numbers on my screen. Somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago, hundreds of people were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their retirement security was hanging by a thread. They were people like my dad, hardworking, honest folks who'd spent decades contributing to a pension fund, trusting that someone responsible was watching over their money. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had spent years mocking my fake job, dismissing the work I did as meaningless number crunching. He had no idea that his own pension fund, his own financial future, depended on exactly the kind of analysis he'd been ridiculing. I opened a new file and began the most important investigation of my career, not knowing that within hours, I'd discover my dad's name buried deep in Henderson Industries employee records. The Henderson Industries employee database loaded slowly on my screen, its outdated interface a stark reminder of how behind the times this company really was. I'd been granted access through our standard client investigation protocols, but something about scrolling through 800 names felt invasive, like reading someone's diary without permission. I started with the executive level, looking for whoever might have authorization to make investment decisions of this magnitude. The CEO was a man named Robert Henderson, presumably a family member of the original founders. His LinkedIn profile showed an MBA from Northwestern and 23 years with the company. Below him, the chief financial officer was listed as Patricia Vance, a woman in her early 50s who joined Henderson just 2 years ago. 2 years ago. Right around the time the risky investments had started. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I made a note and continued scrolling. The management structure was typical for a mid-sized manufacturing company. Operations managers, quality control supervisors, human resources personnel, and dozens of floor supervisors overseeing the actual production work. These were the people my father respected, the ones who got their hands dirty and built real things. Then I saw it. Row 847 in the employee database. Mitchell, David. Department, Assembly Line 3. Hire date, August 15th, 1988. Years of service, 36.8. My hands froze over the keyboard. David Mitchell. My father. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The coincidence seemed impossible. But there it was in black and white. My dad worked for Henderson Industries, the same Henderson Industries whose pension fund was circling the drain because of catastrophically bad investment decisions. The same pension fund that was supposed to support him through retirement in 9 months. I grabbed my phone and called him immediately, my heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Sarah, what's wrong? You never call during work hours. Dad, where do you work again? I tried to keep my voice steady, professional. You know where I work, honey? Henderson Industries. Same place I've been working since before you were born. Why? Henderson Industries in Schaumburg? That's the one. Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on? I closed my eyes, trying to figure out how to explain without violating client confidentiality or sending him into a panic. Dad, I need you to listen to me carefully. Do you know anything about your pension fund? About how it's being managed? He laughed, but it sounded forced. My pension fund? Sarah, I don't know the first thing about that stuff. That's why they have experts handling it. I just show up, do my job, and trust that the money I've been paying in for 37 years will be there when I retire. Why would you even ask about that? Have there been any meetings lately? Any communications about retirement benefits or changes to the pension plan? Well, now that you mention it, we did get some paperwork last month, something about, quote, portfolio diversification and, in quote, enhanced growth opportunities. But Sarah, you know I don't understand that financial mumbo-jumbo. I just signed whatever they told me to sign and figured the smart people upstairs knew what they were doing. The smart people upstairs. If only he knew. Dad, I need you to do me a favor. Can you find that paperwork and read it to me? All of it? Sarah, you're really worrying me now. Is something wrong with my pension? I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Not until I had a complete picture of exactly how bad things were. I'm probably overreacting, Dad. I just want to make sure everything looks normal from your end. Can you check on that paperwork for me? After hanging up, I sat staring at my father's employee record, 37 years of service. He'd started working at Henderson when he was 22 years old, fresh out of high school, determined to build a stable life for himself, and eventually, for his family. He'd met my mother at a company picnic in 1991. They'd bought their first house using Henderson's Employee Assistance Program. I'd grown up hearing stories about his coworkers, his supervisors, the pride he took in his work. All of that history, all of those years of dedication and trust, were now threatened by financial decisions made in corporate boardrooms he'd never seen, by people whose names he probably didn't even know. I dove back into the investment records with renewed urgency. Patricia Vance, the CFO who joined 2 years ago, had indeed been the one authorizing these high-risk investments. Her signature appeared on every major portfolio change since her arrival. But the more I researched her background, the more questions arose. Her previous position had been CFO at a smaller company called Apex Manufacturing, which had filed for bankruptcy just 6 months before she joined Henderson. Before that, she'd worked for a consulting firm that specialized in distressed asset management, a fancy term for companies that bought up failing businesses and stripped them for parts. I called our corporate investigation unit and requested a full background check on Patricia Vance. Within an hour, investigator Tony Chen was sitting at my desk with a thick file and a grim expression. "Sarah, this woman's resume is a parade of red flags," he said, spreading documents across my workspace. "Every company she's worked for in the past 10 years has either gone bankrupt or suffered major financial losses within 18 months of her departure. Either she's the unluckiest CFO in America, or she's deliberately destroying these pension funds." Quote, "But why? What would she gain from bankrupting Henderson's pension fund?" Tony pulled out a document I hadn't seen before, a complex financial instrument called a credit default swap. "Look at this. 3 months ago, Patricia Vance personally purchased insurance that would pay out big if Henderson Industries' pension fund became insolvent. She's essentially betting against the very fund she's supposed to be protecting." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Patricia Vance hadn't been making bad investment decisions. She'd been making deliberately destructive ones. Every cryptocurrency purchase, every high-risk startup investment, every move away from stable securities had been calculated to maximize the chances of the pension fund's collapse. And when it did collapse, she'd collect a massive insurance payout. Meanwhile, 800 employees like my father would lose everything they'd worked for. I spent the rest of the afternoon building an airtight case against Patricia Vance. The evidence was overwhelming once you knew what to look for. Shell companies that she had connections to. Investment firms that kicked back portions of fees to accounts she controlled. A paper trail of financial manipulation that stretched back to her time at Apex Manufacturing, where she'd apparently perfected this scheme before bringing it to Henderson. By 5 o'clock, I had compiled a 47-page report documenting exactly how she'd been systematically looting the pension fund. The mathematical projections were stark. If these investment patterns continued for another 6 months, the fund would be completely insolvent by December. My father's retirement party would become a wake for his financial future. But I also had something else, a solution. Hidden in the fine print of Henderson's pension fund agreements was a clause that allowed for emergency intervention if, quote, gross financial mismanagement could be proven. If we could present this evidence to the right regulatory authorities within the next 30 days, we could potentially freeze Patricia Vance's access to the fund, reverse some of her most recent transactions, and begin the process of restoring the pension to solvency. The catch was that doing so would require me to come forward as the whistleblower. My name would be on the complaint. Patricia Vance would know exactly who had exposed her scheme, and given her connections in Chicago's financial community, my career could be over before it really began. I thought about my father's calloused hands, his pride in his work, his upcoming retirement party. I thought about the 799 other Henderson employees who had no idea their futures were being gambled away by someone they trusted. I thought about Patricia Vance, probably sitting in her corner office at that very moment, planning her next move to drain even more money from the fund. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration. When the investigator answered, I took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. I need to report suspected criminal mismanagement of a pension fund. I have documentation, and I'm willing to testify. As I waited on hold to be transferred to the appropriate department, I wondered what my father would say when he found out that his daughter's pretend job was about to save his retirement. Would he finally understand that those numbers I played with all day represented real people's real lives? Or would he be too proud to admit He'd been wrong about me all along. The hold music stopped, and a stern voice came on the line. "This is Agent Rebecca Walsh, EBSA Criminal Investigations. I understand you have information about pension fund fraud?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And Agent Walsh, you're going to want to clear your calendar for this one." Agent Rebecca Walsh arrived at Meridian Financial Group the next morning with 2 other federal investigators and enough legal paperwork to fill a briefcase. They'd set up in our largest conference room, transforming it into a makeshift command center with laptops, recording equipment, and stacks of financial documents that grew higher by the hour. "Ms. Mitchell, before we proceed, I need you to understand the scope of what you've uncovered," Agent Walsh said, her piercing blue eyes fixed on mine across the polished conference table. "Based on your preliminary report, we believe Patricia Vance may have been running this same scheme at multiple companies across the Midwest. If we're right, we're looking at pension fraud totaling over $200 million. $200 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. But I forced myself to think about it in human terms. Thousands of families, thousands of people like my father, who'd worked their entire lives believing their retirement was secure. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything. But more importantly, we need you to go undercover." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Walsh slid a document across the table, an official cooperation agreement that would make me a federal informant. "Undercover how?" "Patricia Vance doesn't know we're onto her yet. As far as she's concerned, you're just another risk analyst doing routine portfolio reviews. We want to keep it that way while we gather more evidence. Can you continue your normal work at Henderson while documenting everything she does?" I thought about the implications. If Patricia Vance discovered I was investigating her, my career would be over. If she had the kind of political connections Tony Chen suspected, things could get much worse than just losing my job. But if I didn't help, my father and hundreds of other people would lose their life savings. "I'll do it." Over the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. During the day, I maintained my regular responsibilities at Meridian, analyzing other client portfolios and attending mundane meetings about risk management protocols. But every spare moment was dedicated to building the case against Patricia Vance. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated her operation appeared. She wasn't just making random bad investments. She was systematically moving pension money through a network of shell companies, each one designed to obscure the money trail while siphoning off millions in management fees. The companies had names like Strategic Growth Partners and Future Vision Investments, but they all led back to the same offshore accounts. Agent Walsh had given me access to federal databases that revealed the true scope of Patricia's crimes. She'd used identical tactics at Apex Manufacturing, where she'd destroyed a $40 million pension fund before moving on to Henderson. Before that, there'd been Midwest Industrial Solutions, Great Lakes Manufacturing, and at least 3 other companies whose pension funds had mysteriously collapsed shortly after her arrival. The pattern was always the same. Join a company as CFO, gain access to pension fund management, make increasingly risky investments that were guaranteed to fail, collect insurance payouts when the fund went insolvent, then move on to the next victim. It was pension fund serial killing, executed with spreadsheets and financial instruments instead of weapons. Meanwhile, my father had been calling every few days with updates about his retirement planning. He'd found the paperwork I'd asked about and had started paying attention to the quarterly statements that arrived in his mailbox. For the first time in his life, he was asking questions about investment performance and portfolio allocation. "Sarah, I've been looking at these numbers, and I think something might be wrong," he said during one particularly tense phone call. "Last quarter, our pension fund was worth $43 million. This quarter, it's down to $37 million. That's $6 million that just disappeared." How does $6 million just disappear? I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to explain that his CFO was a criminal who was systematically stealing his retirement money. Instead, I had to stick to the cover story Agent Walsh and I had rehearsed. "Market fluctuations can be dramatic, Dad. Sometimes investments go down before they go back up. But Sarah, these aren't just normal investments. They've got money in something called quantum computing futures and vertical farm innovation. I've been working in manufacturing for 37 years, and I've never heard of investments this crazy for a pension fund. It's like someone's gambling with our retirement money." He was absolutely right, of course. Someone was gambling with their retirement money. But it wasn't gambling. It was theft with extra steps. Dad, have you talked to anyone else at work about this? Other employees who might be concerned? You bet I have. Tommy Castellano from Line 2 has been asking the same questions. So has Maria Santos from Quality Control. We're not stupid, Sarah. We might not have college degrees, but we know when something doesn't smell right. This was exactly what Agent Walsh had been hoping for. Employee concerns would provide additional evidence of the scheme's impact and could potentially lead to more witnesses willing to testify. But it also meant that word was starting to spread through the factory floor, which could tip off Patricia Vance that people were asking questions. 3 days later, my worst fears were confirmed. Jennifer knocked on my cubicle wall with an expression of barely controlled panic. Sarah, we have a problem. Patricia Vance just called Marcus directly. She wants to meet with whoever's been analyzing Henderson's portfolio. She specifically asked for you by name. My blood went cold. How could she possibly know I'm the one working on this? I don't know, but Marcus wants to see you in his office immediately. And Sarah? Agent Walsh is already on her way over. The emergency meeting in Marcus's office felt like a war council. Agent Walsh had arrived with backup. 2 more investigators who looked like they'd stepped out of a federal law enforcement handbook. Marcus was pacing behind his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Patricia Vance knows something, Agent Walsh said without preamble. Our surveillance team intercepted a phone call she made this morning to someone she referred to as the cleaner. She specifically mentioned your name, Sarah, and asked about, quote, eliminating the risk analyst problem. The room fell silent. Eliminating the risk analyst problem. That was me. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. It means she's planning to either discredit you professionally or worse. Sarah, we need to accelerate our timeline. How quickly can you get me access to Henderson's internal financial systems? I already have access through our standard client protocols. But if she's suspicious of me, won't logging into their systems tip her off that we're on to her? Not if we do it right. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept her meeting request, but you're going to wear a wire. We need her to incriminate herself on tape. Meanwhile, our cybercrimes unit will simultaneously access Henderson's servers and download every financial record from the past 3 years. Agent Walsh pulled out a device that looked like a pen, but was actually a sophisticated recording system. This will capture everything she says with broadcast quality audio. But Sarah, I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. If she realizes you're recording her, we don't know how she'll react. I took the pen, surprised by how normal it felt in my hand. What about my father? If this goes wrong, if she figures out what we're doing, could she hurt him? We've already arranged for discreet protection for all Henderson employees who've been asking questions about their pension. Your father will be safe. The meeting with Patricia Vance was scheduled for the following afternoon at Henderson's corporate offices. I'd never been to the company where my father had spent most of his adult life, and the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. After years of him dismissing my career, I was finally going to see his workplace, but only because I was there to save it from financial ruin. Henderson Industries occupied a sprawling complex in Schaumburg, with the main manufacturing facility connected to a smaller office building by a covered walkway. As I pulled into the visitor parking lot, I could see workers in Henderson uniforms walking between buildings, probably heading to their lunch break. One of them could have been my father. Patricia Vance's office was on the 3rd floor of the administrative building, overlooking the factory floor where 800 employees were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their financial futures were hanging in the balance. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ms. Mitchell, thank you so much for coming. I've heard wonderful things about your work at Meridian. Please have a seat. I activated the recording pen as I sat down, praying that my nervousness wasn't visible. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me, Ms. Vance. I understand you have some questions about our portfolio analysis. Her smile widened, but there was something predatory about it. Oh, I have more than questions, Sarah. May I call you Sarah? I have concerns. Serious concerns about the accuracy of your risk assessments. She opened a file on her desk and began spreading out financial documents. But these weren't Henderson's investment records. They were documents related to my personal finances, my student loan payments, my apartment lease, even my credit card statements. You see, Sarah, when someone starts asking inconvenient questions about my investment strategies, I like to know who I'm dealing with. And what I've discovered about you is quite interesting. A young woman drowning in student debt, living paycheck to paycheck, desperate to prove herself in a competitive industry. The kind of person who might be willing to fabricate problems where none exist, just to make herself look more valuable to her employers. I forced myself to remain calm, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. I'm not sure what you're implying, Ms. Vance. I'm not implying anything, Sarah. I'm stating it directly. Your analysis of Henderson's pension fund contains several errors that conveniently support a narrative of mismanagement. But here's what you don't understand. I have friends at Meridian Financial Group. Friends who can make sure your errors are highlighted to the right people. Friends who can ensure that your promising career comes to a very sudden end. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Or, we can find a way to work together. I'm willing to make it worth your while to revise your analysis. Let's say, worth $50,000. Cash. Enough to pay off those student loans and give you a fresh start. The recording pen was capturing every word. Patricia Vance was offering me a bribe to falsify my report and allow her to continue destroying the pension fund. It was exactly the kind of evidence Agent Walsh needed to prove criminal intent. That's very generous, I said carefully, but I'd need to understand exactly what changes you want me to make to my analysis. Nothing major. Just adjust your risk projections to show that our recent investments are performing within acceptable parameters. Emphasize the growth potential rather than dwelling on short-term volatility. Make it clear that Henderson's pension fund is stable and well managed. And the Bitcoin derivatives, the failed startup investments? She waved dismissively. Market corrections. Temporary setbacks that will recover over time. Sarah, you're young and idealistic, but you need to understand how the real world works. Pension funds require aggressive growth strategies to keep up with inflation and rising benefit costs. What looks risky to someone with limited experience is actually prudent long-term planning. It was a masterclass in manipulation, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd successfully sold this story multiple times before. If I hadn't known the truth about her background, I might have actually believed her. I'll need to think about this, I said. Of course. But Sarah? Her smile turned cold. Don't think too long. My offer expires at the end of business tomorrow. And if you decide not to accept it, well, let's just say I hope you've been saving money for a career change. I walked out of Henderson Industries that afternoon feeling like I was carrying a live grenade. The recording pen in my purse contained Patricia Vance's confession, her bribery attempt, and enough evidence to bring down her entire operation. But it also contained her threats. And something in her voice told me she wasn't bluffing about destroying my career. Agent Walsh was waiting in an unmarked sedan across the street from the Henderson complex. I slid into the passenger seat and immediately handed over the recording device. She took the bait, I said. Everything's on there. The bribe offer, the threats, even her admission that she has contacts inside Meridian who can sabotage my career. Walsh plugged the device into a laptop, and we listened to the entire conversation in real time. When Patricia's voice came through the speakers offering me $50,000 to falsify my report, Walsh's jaw tightened noticeably. This is better than we hoped for, she said. But we have a problem. She gave you until tomorrow evening to make your decision. That means she's planning to move fast, probably to transfer more assets offshore before we can stop her. We need to accelerate everything. What happens now? Now we spring the trap. Tonight, our Financial Crimes Unit will execute search warrants on all of Patricia Vance's known accounts and properties. Tomorrow morning, she'll arrive at work to find federal agents waiting for her. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Walsh turned to face me directly. We've been monitoring communications between Patricia and several other individuals who appear to be part of her network. Based on intercepted calls, we believe she's planning to blame the pension fund's problems on someone else. Someone whose analysis first identified the missing money. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She's going to frame me. That's our assessment. Tomorrow, when she realizes the federal investigation is closing in, She'll claim that you falsified your risk analysis to cover up your own embezzlement. She'll present evidence that you had access to Henderson's accounts and opportunity to steal the money. It'll be your word against hers, and she's very good at this game. I stared out the car window at the Henderson Industries building, watching employees stream out at the end of their shift. Normal people heading home to normal lives, completely unaware that their retirement security was the subject of a federal investigation. What can we do to protect me? We're going to beat her to the punch. Tonight, we'll arrest Patricia Vance at her home. Tomorrow morning, you're going to Henderson Industries to meet with the company's board of directors. You'll present your findings directly to them, with federal agents present as witnesses. By the time she has a chance to point fingers at you, she'll already be in federal custody. That evening, I sat in my apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. In less than 72 hours, I'd gone from routine portfolio analysis to federal informant to potential target of a criminal conspiracy. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Can't wait to see you at Sunday dinner. Mom's making your favorite pot roast. Sunday dinner. The weekly family tradition where my parents caught up on my life, and I pretended to be interested in my father's stories about factory drama and union negotiations. How was I supposed to sit at their dining room table and act normal when I knew his entire retirement was hanging by a thread? I couldn't tell him the truth yet. Agent Walsh had been clear that operational security was critical until Patricia Vance was in custody, but the weight of keeping this secret from the person whose life I was trying to save felt almost unbearable. At 11:30 that night, Agent Walsh called. It's done. Patricia Vance is in federal custody. We executed the search warrant on her home and found everything. Offshore account information, communications with her co-conspirators, even detailed plans for her next target. Sarah, you just helped us take down one of the most sophisticated pension fraud operations we've ever encountered. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt exhausted. What happens now? Now you get to be the hero. Tomorrow morning, you'll present your findings to Henderson's board of directors. They'll learn that their CFO was a criminal, but they'll also learn that one of their employees' daughters saved their company from financial ruin. I think your father might finally understand what you do for a living. The next morning, I arrived at Henderson Industries to find the parking lot filled with news vans and reporters. Word had leaked about the federal investigation, and the story was already breaking on local news channels. As I walked through the main entrance, I could see clusters of employees huddled together, talking in worried whispers about what this meant for their jobs and their retirement benefits. The boardroom was packed with grim-faced executives, federal agents, and legal representatives. Robert Henderson himself was there, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. When I entered the room carrying my analysis reports, every conversation stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Walsh announced, this is Sarah Mitchell, the risk analyst whose investigation uncovered the criminal activity that we believe has been ongoing at your company for the past 2 years. I opened my laptop and began the presentation I'd rehearsed a dozen times, charts showing the pension fund's decline, transaction records documenting Patricia Vance's fraudulent investments, projections of what would have happened if the scheme had continued unchecked. Based on our analysis, if Patricia Vance's activities had continued for another 6 months, Henderson Industries' pension fund would have been completely insolvent by December of this year, I explained to the silent room. Every current employee and retiree would have lost their entire retirement benefits. Robert Henderson raised his hand. Ms. Mitchell, can you tell us exactly how much money we're talking about? How much did she steal? I pulled up the final calculation I'd completed that morning. Approximately $18 million was diverted from the pension fund into fraudulent investments and shell companies controlled by Patricia Vance and her associates. However, working with federal investigators, we've been able to trace and freeze most of these assets. We estimate that approximately $14 million can be recovered and returned to the pension fund. The relief in the room was palpable. $14 million wouldn't restore the fund to its original value, but it would prevent complete collapse and allow current retirees to continue receiving their benefits. There's something else, I continued. One of your long-term employees played a crucial role in uncovering this fraud. David Mitchell from Assembly Line 3 was among the first workers to notice irregularities in the quarterly pension statements. His questions and concerns provided additional evidence that helped federal investigators build their case. Quote, I hadn't planned to mention my father specifically, but seeing the fear in these executives' eyes, I realized they needed to know that their employees weren't just victims. They were partners in protecting the company's future. After the formal presentation, Robert Henderson approached me privately. Ms. Mitchell, I understand that David Mitchell is your father. Is that correct? Yes, sir. 37 years he's worked for this company. 37 years of showing up every day, doing his job, never asking for special treatment. And now his daughter saves our pension fund. There's something poetic about that, don't you think? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Sarah, something big is happening at work. Federal agents everywhere. Can you call me when you get a chance? I'm worried about my pension. I looked at Robert Henderson. Sir, would it be possible for you to deliver the news about the pension fund recovery to your employees personally? I think they deserve to hear it from you rather than from news reports. Of course. In fact, would you be willing to stand with me when I make the announcement? I think our employees should know who saved their retirement. An hour later, I found myself standing on the factory floor of Henderson Industries for the first time in my life. 800 employees had gathered in the main assembly area, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and confusion about the morning's events. Many of them wore the same expression I'd seen on my father's face countless times, the wary look of working people who'd learned not to trust promises from management. Robert Henderson stepped up to a makeshift podium, his voice echoing through the cavernous space via the facility's PA system. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Our former CFO was a criminal who stole money from your pension fund, but I'm here to tell you that your retirement benefits are safe. Thanks to the work of federal investigators and a risk analyst named Sarah Mitchell, we've recovered the stolen funds and secured your pension for the future. A murmur ran through the crowd. I spotted my father near the back of the group, his face cycling through confusion, relief, and something that might have been pride. Some of you know David Mitchell from Line 3, Henderson continued. Well, Sarah Mitchell is his daughter, and she's the person who exposed this fraud and saved your retirement. Quote, the applause started slowly, then built to something thunderous. I could see my father pushing through the crowd, his eyes locked on mine with an expression I'd never seen before. When he reached me, he didn't say anything at first. He just pulled me into a hug that smelled like machine oil and decades of honest work. Sarah, he finally whispered, I'm sorry I never understood what you do. I'm sorry I made fun of your job. You saved us. You saved all of us. Looking around at the faces of Henderson's employees, people who looked just like my father, who'd worked just as hard and deserved just as much security in their retirement, I finally understood why my job mattered. Those numbers on my computer screen weren't just abstract data points. They were families, dreams, futures, that real people had spent their lives building. Patricia Vance had seen the same numbers and seen opportunity for personal profit. But I'd seen 800 families who trusted that someone, somewhere, was protecting what they'd worked so hard to earn. As federal agents led Patricia away in handcuffs that afternoon, I realized my father had been wrong about a lot of things. But he'd been right about one thing. Real work did matter. My work was just as real as his. It just happened to be done with spreadsheets instead of welding torches. 6 months later, I sat in the witness box of the Federal District Court in downtown Chicago, facing a jury of 12 people who would decide Patricia Vance's fate. The courtroom was packed with Henderson Industries employees, including my father, who had taken a personal day to attend the trial. This was the culmination of everything we'd worked for, the chance to see justice served for one of the most audacious pension fraud schemes in Illinois history. Patricia Vance looked different than she had in her corporate office. Gone was the confident executive in designer suits. The woman sitting at the defendant's table wore a simple gray dress, and the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. Her legal team had spent months trying to discredit my analysis, claiming that a young, inexperienced analyst had misinterpreted routine investment fluctuations as criminal activity. Federal prosecutor Amanda Torres stood at the podium holding the final piece of evidence that would seal Patricia's conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, You've heard extensive testimony about complex financial instruments and sophisticated fraud schemes, but I want to close by playing one final recording that captures the essence of this case. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia's voice filled the air through the sound system. Her words from that meeting 6 months ago seemed even more damning in the formal setting of a federal trial. I'm willing to make it worth your while to revise your analysis. Let's say, worth $50,000. Cash. When the recording ended, several jurors were shaking their heads in disgust. Patricia's attempt to bribe me had been the final nail in her legal coffin. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all 17 counts of pension fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Patricia Vance was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $43 million in restitution to the pension funds she'd damaged. But her conviction was just the beginning of a much larger story. The success of our investigation had opened floodgates that nobody could have anticipated. Within weeks of Patricia's arrest, employees from other companies began coming forward with suspicions about their own pension funds. Agent Walsh's task force grew from 3 investigators to 15, then to an entire department dedicated to pension fraud cases. I found myself at the center of this expanding investigation, consulting on cases across the Midwest where Patricia's network had operated. Each new case revealed another layer of the conspiracy: corrupt financial advisors, complicit insurance companies, and shell corporations designed to hide stolen pension money. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Local news stations wanted interviews about the quote, young analyst who saved Henderson Industries. National financial publications wrote feature stories about pension fund security. I even received a call from a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the complete story of Patricia's fraud network. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Henderson Industries Board of Directors voted unanimously to establish the David Mitchell Pension Security Award, an annual recognition for employees who demonstrated vigilance in protecting retirement benefits. My father was the first recipient, honored for his role in identifying the initial red flags that had started the entire investigation. At the award ceremony held in the same factory floor where I'd first met Henderson's employees, my father gave a speech that left the entire room silent. 38 years ago, I started working at this company because I wanted honest work that would let me provide for my family, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the PA system. I believed that if I showed up every day, did my job right, and paid into my pension, the company would take care of me when I was too old to work anymore. That trust was almost betrayed by someone we thought we could count on. He paused, looking directly at me in the front row. But it was saved by someone I'd spent years not understanding. My daughter Sarah does work I never appreciated because I couldn't see how numbers on a computer screen connected to real people's lives. I was wrong about her job, and I was wrong about the value of what she does. Sarah's work, analyzing risk, understanding complex financial systems, protecting people from fraud, that's just as important as anything that happens on this factory floor. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most to me was the expression on my father's face. For the first time in my life, I could see that he was genuinely proud of who I'd become. The changes at Henderson Industries went far beyond just recovering the stolen pension money. Robert Henderson had implemented new oversight procedures that gave employees direct access to quarterly financial reports and established an independent committee to monitor pension fund investments. Every major financial decision now required approval from multiple parties, making it virtually impossible for a single person to manipulate the fund again. More importantly, other companies began adopting similar transparency measures. The Henderson model became a template for pension fund security that was studied by corporate governance experts and recommended by federal regulators. My own career trajectory changed dramatically as well. Meridian Financial Group promoted me to senior risk analyst and assigned me to lead their new pension security division. We developed software tools that could automatically flag suspicious investment patterns, potentially preventing future fraud before it reached critical levels. The work was challenging and often stressful, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Every analysis I completed represented real families whose financial security depended on my diligence. Every red flag I identified could prevent another Patricia Vance from destroying another pension fund. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with my father. Our Sunday dinners became something I actually looked forward to, rather than enduring out of obligation. He started asking detailed questions about my cases, trying to understand the technical aspects of financial fraud investigation. He even began reading the financial section of the newspaper, something he'd never shown interest in before. One evening, about a year after Patricia's conviction, he called me with excitement in his voice that I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Sarah, you need to see this. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal about pension fraud prevention, and they quoted you. They called you one of the leading experts in pension security analysis in the United States." My daughter, an expert quoted in the Wall Street Journal. I could hear the pride in his voice, and it meant more to me than any professional recognition I'd ever received. The final chapter of Patricia Vance's story came 2 years later, when federal investigators completed their analysis of her entire network. In total, she and her associates had stolen over $230 million from pension funds across 7 states. 43 companies had been victimized, affecting more than 12,000 employees and retirees. But because of our investigation and the cases that followed, federal prosecutors were able to recover nearly 80% of the stolen funds. Thousands of families who might have lost their retirement security were able to preserve their financial futures. Standing in my corner office at Meridian Financial Group, the promotion had come with a significant upgrade in workspace. I often looked out at the Chicago skyline and thought about all the people in those buildings whose retirements depended on the work that analysts like me did every day. It was a responsibility I took seriously, knowing that behind every number in every spreadsheet was a real person who'd worked hard and deserved to retire with dignity. My father understood that now. The man who'd once dismissed my career as playing with numbers had become one of my strongest advocates. He'd even started referring clients to Meridian when his friends at other companies expressed concerns about their pension funds. The last time I visited Henderson Industries, I stopped by Assembly Line 3 to see my father at work. Watching him operate machinery with practiced precision, I realized that we weren't so different after all. He built physical products that people needed and used. I built financial security systems that protected people's futures. Both types of work required skill, dedication, and attention to detail. Both types of work mattered. As I walked through the factory that day, several employees stopped to thank me for saving their pensions. But what struck me most was something my father had said during his award speech. "Trust is the foundation of everything we do here. When that trust is betrayed, it takes people like Sarah to restore it." That's what I did for a living, not just analyzing numbers, but protecting the trust that working people placed in the systems designed to secure their futures. It was work I was proud of, work that mattered, and work that my father finally understood was just as real and valuable as anything he'd ever built with his hands. The story of Patricia Vance's fraud network became a cautionary tale studied in business schools and law enforcement academies. But for me, it remained a personal reminder that the most important work often happens quietly, in conference rooms and computer terminals, where dedicated professionals stand guard against those who would exploit other people's trust. My father never mocked my job title again. In fact, he'd started introducing me to his friends as my daughter Sarah, the financial fraud investigator. And every time he said it, I could hear the pride in his voice that had been missing for so many years. That pride meant everything to me, not because I needed his approval, but because it represented something much larger. It represented his understanding that protecting people's financial security was just as important as any other kind of work. It represented his recognition that trust, once broken, could be restored by people willing to fight for what was right. And it represented the simple truth that had taken us both years to understand. Real work comes in many forms, but the most meaningful work is always about protecting and serving others, whether you do it with your hands or with spreadsheets and determination. 5 years have passed since that first phone call when my father dismissed my career as computer nonsense. Today, I'm sitting in the green room of a major television studio in New York City, about to appear on a national business program to discuss the new federal legislation that bears my name, the Mitchell-Henderson Pension Protection Act. The irony isn't lost on me. The daughter, whose job was once mocked as meaningless, is now being consulted by Congress on how to protect retirement security for millions of American workers. But the real victory isn't the recognition or the legislation. It's what happened at Henderson Industries 3 weeks ago. My father's actual retirement party. Unlike the celebration he'd planned 5 years earlier, this one took place with complete confidence in his financial future. The recovered pension funds had been invested conservatively and grown steadily. Additional contributions from the company, motivated by their desire to rebuild trust after the Patricia Vance scandal, had actually improved benefits beyond their original levels. Robert Henderson himself had spoken at the party, telling the assembled crowd that my father represented the best of what their company stood for: dedication, integrity, and the wisdom to ask hard questions when something didn't seem right. But the moment that will stay with me forever came when my father stood up to address his coworkers one final time. 43 years ago, I started working here as a young man who thought he knew what real work looked like, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every word. I thought real work was done with your hands, building things you could see and touch. I was proud of that work, and I still am. But I learned something important these past few years. He gestured toward me in the crowd. My daughter Sarah does work I couldn't see or understand. She works with numbers, and computers, and complicated financial systems. For years I made the mistake of thinking that because I couldn't see the product of her labor, it wasn't real. I was wrong. Sarah's work protects our work. Her analysis and expertise stand between us and people who would steal our futures. That's as real as anything I've ever built on the factory floor. Quote, the spontaneous standing ovation that followed wasn't just for my father. It was for every worker who'd ever been told their concerns didn't matter, every analyst who'd been dismissed as impractical, and every person who'd chosen to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. But the story doesn't end with personal vindication. The Patricia Vance case had revealed systemic weaknesses in how pension funds were monitored and protected nationwide. Working with federal regulators, I'd helped design new oversight requirements that transformed how companies managed retirement benefits. The Mitchell-Henderson Act, scheduled to be signed into law next month, requires all pension funds over $10 million to undergo independent risk analysis every 6 months. It establishes whistleblower protections for employees who report suspicious activity and creates a federal database that tracks pension fund managers across state lines to prevent people like Patricia from moving from company to company. More importantly, it mandates employee representation on pension oversight committees, ensuring that workers have a voice in how their retirement money is invested. My father now serves on Henderson's committee, bringing the perspective of someone who understands that every investment decision affects real families with real needs. The legislation also creates a rapid response team within the Department of Labor, specifically trained to investigate pension fraud. Agent Rebecca Walsh now heads this unit, and they've already prevented 6 major fraud schemes based on early warning systems we developed together. The personal transformation in my relationship with my father extends beyond just mutual respect. He's become one of my closest advisors, offering insights about worker concerns that help me identify potential problems before they become crises. His practical understanding of how manufacturing employees think about retirement security has proven invaluable in designing policies that actually protect people, rather than just creating bureaucratic procedures. Last month, we traveled together to Detroit, where another manufacturing company was facing pension problems. Watching my father address a room full of worried workers, explaining how they could protect themselves and what questions to ask about their benefits, I realized that our collaboration had created something neither of us could have achieved alone. He brought credibility and understanding of worker concerns. I brought technical expertise and knowledge of financial systems. Together, we could communicate complex pension security issues in ways that actually helped people protect themselves. The ripple effects of our work continue expanding in unexpected directions. Business schools now teach case studies based on the Henderson investigation. Law enforcement agencies use our detection methods to identify pension fraud earlier. Insurance companies have reformed their oversight procedures to prevent the kind of schemes Patricia operated. But the most meaningful impact remains at the individual level. I receive emails regularly from workers at companies across the country who've used our educational materials to identify problems with their pension funds. Each prevented fraud represents families who will retire with dignity instead of facing financial ruin. Jennifer, my former colleague who first alerted me to the Henderson irregularities, now runs our expanded pension security division at Meridian. We've grown from a 2-person team to a department of 15 analysts who specialize in protecting retirement benefits. The work we pioneered has become an entire industry dedicated to safeguarding working people's financial futures. The television interview I'm about to give will reach millions of viewers, but I know the most important audience will be workers like my father, people who've spent their lives contributing to pension funds and trusting that someone responsible is watching over their money. My job is to explain complex financial concepts in terms they can understand and actions they can take. The segment producer just knocked on the green room door. It's time to go live to discuss how ordinary workers can protect themselves from pension fraud. As I walk toward the studio, I think about my father watching from his living room in Chicago, probably calling his friends to tell them his daughter is on national television. 5 years ago, he would have been embarrassed to explain what I did for a living. Today, he introduces me as the pension fraud expert and keeps newspaper clippings of articles that mention my work. The transformation isn't just in how he sees my career. It's in how he understands the connection between different types of work and the shared responsibility we all have to protect each other. The host introduces me as Sarah Mitchell, whose investigation into pension fraud led to new federal legislation protecting retirement security for American workers. But in my mind, I'm still David Mitchell's daughter, the one who learned from him that real work means showing up every day and taking care of the people who depend on you. The difference is that now we both understand work comes in many forms. His work builds the products that keep our economy running. My work builds the systems that keep his work meaningful by ensuring that a lifetime of labor translates into retirement security. Patricia Vance is serving her sentence in federal prison, her financial empire dismantled, and her victims compensated. The companies she targeted have rebuilt their pension funds with stronger oversight and transparency. The workers she tried to exploit are retiring with dignity and financial security. But beyond the legal victories and policy changes, the most important outcome is simpler. Trust has been restored. Workers trust that their concerns will be heard. Companies trust that proper oversight will protect them from fraud. Families trust that retirement security is achievable through honest work and responsible planning. That trust didn't rebuild itself. It required people willing to ask hard questions, investigate suspicious activity, and stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. It required analysts willing to dig deeper into complex financial data, and workers willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. Most importantly, it required recognition that protecting people's financial futures is just as important as any other kind of work, whether you do it with welding equipment or spreadsheet analysis, with factory machinery or federal legislation. As the interview begins and I start explaining pension security to a national audience, I'm representing more than just my own expertise. I'm representing every worker who's ever wondered if their retirement benefits were safe, every analyst who's worked late to uncover fraud, and every person who's chosen to use their skills to protect others rather than exploit them. The questions start coming from the host, and I answer them thinking about my father and his coworkers, translating complex financial concepts into practical advice that real people can use to protect themselves. This is the work that matters, not the recognition or the legislation or the media attention, but the simple act of helping people understand how to safeguard their financial futures. When the interview ends and I walk back to the green room, my phone already has 3 missed calls from my father. I know he'll want to discuss every detail of the segment, probably offering suggestions for how I could have explained things even more clearly. 5 years ago, those conversations would have been impossible. Today, they're the foundation of work that protects thousands of families and continues growing every day. Sometimes the most important transformations happen one conversation at a time, one investigation at a time. One person finally understanding that their work, whatever form it takes, has the power to make other people's lives better and more secure. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.